The general didn't ask for volunteers. He just picked her. A quiet woman near the back of the line. No rank on her collar, no unit patch on her sleeve. Just a name on a civilian waiver and eyes that hadn't blinked since the wind shifted. The range officer laughed first, then the Marines, then everyone. She didn't react. She walked to the Barrett M107 like she'd done it 10,000 times, pressed her cheek to the stock, and the desert went absolutely still. 3 seconds later, steel rang at 2,000 meters. Nobody laughed after that. If you've never seen a room full of warriors go completely silent, this is what it looks like. Stay with us until the end. And if you're new here, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments. What city, what country are you watching from? We want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bus from Reno dropped her off at the wrong gate. That was the first thing Elena Brooks noticed about Redstone Precision Training Center. The civilian access signs were wrong, rotated 45 degrees by desert wind and never corrected, pointing toward the motor pool instead of the main check-in building. She adjusted without complaint, read the topography of the facility the way she read everything, and walked the extra 300 meters through loose gravel in mid-morning heat without breaking stride. She was 39 years old and looked, depending on the light, either younger or considerably older than that. There was something economical about the way she moved. No wasted motion, no fidgeting, no adjustment of the civilian duffel slung over one shoulder. Her hair was dark and pulled back without effort. She wore khaki pants, a faded blue long sleeve despite the heat, and boots that were too serious for a tourist. Not military issue, but not recreational either. The kind of boots you ordered from a catalog that didn't advertise. The check-in clerk, a 22-year-old Army contractor named Dillard, looked up from his screen when she reached the window. Name: Brooks, Elena. He typed, frowned, typed again. You're listed as an observer participant. Civilian track. He said civilian the way some people said trainee, meaning don't touch anything important. You're aware this week's range schedule includes live fire qualification with military-grade platforms? That's why I registered. Dillard looked at her over the rim of his monitor. She was not what he expected when people registered for the Civilian Observer Program, which was mostly retired hobbyists, defense contractors nursing government relationships, and the occasional journalist angling for access. She didn't offer anything else, didn't smile to smooth the silence. Okay. He printed her badge. Building C orientation starts in 20. Don't be late. Range officer's a hard ass. She took the badge without looking at it. I won't be late, she said. The orientation room smelled like gun oil and industrial air conditioning, and it held 14 people, 2 defense contractors with lanyards from companies Elena recognized, a small cluster of Marine reservists attending as an informal unit field trip, 3 journalists, and a handful of civilians ranging from a retired police lieutenant to a man who kept calling the Barrett M107 the Big 50 in a way that suggested he'd seen it mostly in video games. Gunnery Sergeant Dale Pritchard ran the orientation the way he ran everything, loudly, efficiently, and with a specific kind of contempt for anyone he'd already decided wasn't serious. Pritchard was 51, built like a fire hydrant, and had been running civilian range programs at Redstone for 6 years. Before that, 2 combat tours, instructor duty at Quantico, a brief and mutually unhappy stint training foreign military personnel in a country he wasn't allowed to name in polite company. He had the sun-damaged skin and 1,000-yard mannerisms of someone who had spent years looking at things through glass. He walked the group through safety protocols, range etiquette, the liability structure, and the basic mechanics of the platforms they might observe or, for registered participants, potentially handle under direct supervision. His eyes moved across the room as he talked, categorizing. When they landed on Elena, they stayed for exactly 1 second longer than everyone else. She was seated in the back row, notepad open, writing nothing, just watching him. Pritchard moved on. The Barrett M107, he said, tapping the wall diagram, fires a 50 caliber BMG round. Effective range with a trained operator is up to 1,800 meters. Muzzle energy on departure is approximately 15,000 foot-pounds. For context, a standard 9mm produces about 350. You are not going to accidentally manage this weapon. He paused. You are also not going to impress anyone by asking to fire it. That question comes up every session, and the answer is no unless you've been cleared for it in advance. One of the Marine reservists, young, square-jawed, the kind of confident that came from a gym rather than experience, raised his hand. What does cleared mean? It means someone with stars on their collar called ahead. It means we have your qualification record on file, and it doesn't make us laugh. Pritchard's eyes flicked to the back of the room for just a fraction of a second. It means you've put rounds downrange under conditions that would make most people in this room quit before they touched the trigger. The young Marine nodded like he understood. He did not understand. By afternoon, the temperature at the live fire line had climbed past 104. Lane 7 was the long-distance lane, a corridor of hard-packed desert that stretched northeast toward a ridgeline, with steel targets mounted at graduated distances from 300 meters out to the maximum platform capability. Wind flags dotted the lane at 200-meter intervals, small triangles of orange nylon that snapped and shifted with the variable crosswind rolling off the mountains. The Marine reservists were on lanes 3 through 5, working through a standard qualification sequence with the M40A6, the Corps' current issue sniper platform. They were decent shooters. A few were better than decent. Their groupings at 800 meters were respectable. Their groupings at 1200 were considerably less so, but nobody was being unkind about it. Elena had been assigned to Lane 7 for observation. She stood behind the safety line with a clipboard she hadn't written on since morning, watching the wind flags. She'd been doing this for most of the afternoon, not the shooters, the flags. Corporal Reyes, 24, the square-jawed Marine from orientation, noticed her first. He'd been watching her watch the flags for the better part of an hour. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The wind," she said. "There's a gauge at the station." He pointed to the electronic readout mounted on the lane post. "Real-time data." "I know." He waited for elaboration. She didn't offer any. Reyes looked at his buddy, Lance Corporal Tatum, who shrugged. "The gauge reads at 1 point of elevation," Elena said, not looking away from the flags. "The round travels through multiple elevation layers over distance. Each layer has different velocity, different pressure variance. The flags tell you the story, the gauge doesn't." Reyes blinked. "Are you an instructor?" "No." "Then how do you—" "Corporal." Pritchard appeared behind them, apparently from nowhere, in the way that senior NCOs sometimes did. "You're on deck. Stop bothering the observers." Reyes went, but he looked back once. Lieutenant General Marcus Hale arrived at Redstone at 1400 hours in a vehicle with no flags, no escort beyond a single aide, and clothing that was deliberately ambiguous. A subdued utility uniform with no rank visible, the kind of intentional informality that senior officers used when they wanted to move through a facility without reshaping the behavior of everyone in it. He was 61, lean in the way that came from decades of physical discipline and not from vanity, with gray at the temples and the kind of eyes that registered everything without advertising that they were doing so. He'd commanded at every level, from a rifle platoon in the desert in the early 90s through 3 stars, and a position that required him to know things that didn't appear in the unclassified chain of command. He was technically at Redstone to review the updated long-range qualification program. His aide had the documentation. Hale had read it on the flight and retained what was relevant. But when he stepped out of the vehicle, and the first person he saw at Lane 7, across 300 meters of open desert and shimmering heat, was a small figure in a blue long sleeve standing completely still behind a wind flag. Something in his memory shifted. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He walked toward the observation deck. The moment happened quietly, the way most significant things do. Pritchard had just wrapped the mid-afternoon segment when one of the civilian participants, the video game man, whose name was apparently Gerald, loudly asked if he could fire the Barrett. Pritchard started his standard refusal. Then Elena spoke. "I'd like to request Elaine," she said. Her voice was level, not combative, the way a person speaks when they're stating a fact about the weather. "The M107, Lane 7, single operator, unsupported." The room paused. Not dramatically, just a beat, the way a conversation pauses when someone says something that doesn't match the established order. Pritchard looked at her. "Ms. Brooks?" "Yes." "This is an observer registration. You're not—" "I signed up for participant clearance. It's in my file under a DoD addendum. Check the secondary registration number." Pritchard looked at his clipboard. He flipped 2 pages. He stopped. He looked at her differently then, still skeptical, but something had shifted in the architecture of his skepticism. He turned to his range assistant, a younger sergeant named Kopech, and said quietly, "Pull her full file. Secondary DoD code." Kopech went to the station terminal. While they waited, one of the Marine reservists, not Reyes, a different one, broader and louder, a staff sergeant named Whitmore, made the mistake of narrating his thoughts aloud. "Come on," Whitmore said, not quietly enough. He was talking to the Marine next to him, but he'd angled his body so Elena could hear. "The M107 weighs 30 pounds. The recoil is like getting hit by a truck. I've seen trained guys get knocked around by it." He gestured vaguely in Elena's direction. "No offense, but this isn't a tourist attraction." Several people laughed. The defense contractor guys. A journalist, Gerald. Elena did not move, did not turn, did not acknowledge. Reyes, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. That was when Hale stepped off the observation deck and walked onto the range floor. He moved past the senior range officers without stopping, past the equipment cages, past the assembled group. He was still in his subdued uniform. No one had properly identified him yet except Pritchard, who came to attention without fanfare. Hale looked at Pritchard. "Let her shoot," he said. Not a question, not an explanation. Pritchard opened his mouth, closed it, and said, "Yes, sir." Whitmore looked at the aide who had quietly materialized at the edge of the group and was now displaying credentials that made Whitmore's face change color. He stopped talking. Kopech came back from the terminal looking like a man who had opened a file expecting a grocery list and found a bomb. "Sir," he said to Pritchard, voice lowered. "I can't. This is above my access level. I got to the secondary index and it locked me out. Red flag clearance block." Hale heard him. He walked to the terminal, entered an authorization code from memory, a long one, the kind that wasn't written down anywhere, and the screen unlocked. He read for a moment. His expression didn't change. He had long ago trained himself not to let his expression change when reading things that warranted a reaction. He looked up. "Sergeant Kopech." "Sir?" "Find her a mat, a spotting scope, and a fresh box of M33 ball." He paused. "And tell Sergeant Whitmore he's on brass pickup for the afternoon." They staged Elena at the bench in Lane 7. The Barrett M107 was already mounted on the bipod, a massive angular piece of military engineering that looked excessive even next to its transport case. 4 feet of controlled violence, 29 pounds unloaded, a fluted barrel designed to manage the thermal load of repeated firing. The Night Force optic mounted on top was worth more than most people's cars. The crowd had reorganized itself. The journalists had their phones out. Pritchard had already told them once to put them away, and they'd half-heartedly complied. The Marines had moved to Lane 7's observation area. Even Gerald had stopped asking questions and was watching. Elena knelt beside the rifle first. Not behind it. Beside it. She ran her right hand along the barrel length without touching the scope. Checked the bolt handle. Pressed 2 fingers lightly against the bipod legs to test for stability on the particular surface texture of Lane 7's bench. "She's checking the bipod angle," Reyes said quietly, to no one in particular. "She hasn't even loaded it," Tatum said. "That's the point." She spent 4 minutes on the preliminary inspection. It was not theatrical. She wasn't performing the inspection for the audience. She was doing it because she always did it, because that discipline had been etched into her over years until it was as automatic as breathing. She checked the chamber twice. She looked through the optic and spent 90 seconds doing nothing visible except adjusting something in fractions of a turn. Then she looked at the wind flags. Lane 7's flags were giving her a 3 to 5 knot right-to-left variable at surface level, with the highest flag, at the 1,600-meter mark, showing a tighter, more consistent push from the southwest. The electronic gauge at her station read 4 knots. She looked at the gauge, looked at the flags, and mentally filed the discrepancy. The target was a 16-inch steel plate at 1,980 meters. Not the standard qualification distance. Someone had set it up for the afternoon demonstration. Either Hale had asked for it, or it had been pre-staged. She didn't know and didn't care. 1,980 meters in this heat, at this elevation, with a variable crosswind and a rifle she'd never personally zeroed. She settled into position. The stock came to her cheek with a precision that had nothing to do with theater and everything to do with 10,000 repetitions. She did not grip the rifle aggressively. Her right hand was firm but not white-knuckled. Her left hand supported the rear of the stock. Both elbows found purchase on the bench surface at angles she'd calculated without consciously calculating them. She was still for a long time. Not the stillness of nervousness. The stillness of someone who has learned that the moment before the trigger breaks is the most important moment in the sequence, and that hurrying it costs everything. "What's she doing?" Gerald asked. Nobody answered him. The Barrett fired. The concussion was physical, not just sound but pressure, a wall of atmosphere that rolled back from the muzzle and hit the observers in the chest like a flat hand. Several people flinched. One of the defense contractors took a half step backward involuntarily. Gerald made a noise. Elena did not move. Her cheeks stayed welded to the stock. Her left hand was already making a micro-adjustment to the rear support. 3 seconds of silence. Then, from 1,980 meters away, delayed by distance and thinning air, a sound like a bat hitting a metal trash can. Sharp, clean, clang. The spotting scope operator, Kopech, looked up from his glass. "Hit," he said. The word landed in the group like something heavy dropped from a height. Nobody said anything for a moment. Elena had already loaded the next round. 2 small clicks of the turret. Right, fractional. She'd watched the dust off the steel plate and adjusted for the wind shift she'd seen in the flags at the 1600 mark, which had been pushing slightly harder than its surface cousin. The Barrett fired again. The concussion. The 3-second wait. The world holding its breath. Clang. "Hit," Kopech said again. His voice had changed slightly. Something had gone out of the professional neutrality of it. Reyes had his spotting scope up now, the personal one he'd brought for the day's qualification work. He found the target. He looked at where the first round had struck the plate and where the second had struck the plate. He lowered the scope slowly. "Tatum," he said. "Yeah. Look at that grouping. Well, 3rd round, 4th round." By the 3rd, the observers had stopped making sounds between impacts. There was something about the rhythm of it, the shot, the weight, the steel, that imposed a kind of reverence. Nobody had authorized this response. It just happened, the way respect happens when it's earned without being requested. By the 4th round, Staff Sergeant Whitmore, who had been picking up brass 30 meters away under the watchful eye of a range safety officer, had stopped pretending to work and was watching Lane 7 with an expression he would have denied making if anyone had described it back to him later. Elena loaded the 5th round. She looked at the flags one more time. The surface-level flag at the near end of the lane had gone slightly slack. The wind had dropped for a moment, one of those brief and unpredictable desert pauses where the air just stops moving. She waited. 7 seconds. The flag twitched, shifted, settled into the same southwest push she'd been reading. She fired. The 5th concussion rolled back. The wait. Clang. And then the range was completely quiet except for the wind and the distant vibration of the steel plate settling on its mounting bracket, still ringing from 5 impacts in a pattern that Kopech, when he'd finished with the spotting scope, would describe in his notes as sub-MOA grouping at 1,980 meters under variable crosswind conditions, unsupported optic, unzeroed platform. He would underline unzeroed. Elena did not stand immediately. She stayed in position for a moment, doing what any disciplined shooter does, confirming the range was clear, that no subsequent action was required, that the sequence was complete. Then she engaged the safety, raised herself off the bench, and began the process of clearing the weapon. Nobody applauded. Not because it wasn't warranted, but because nobody quite knew what they had just witnessed well enough to know how to respond to it. General Hale walked to the lane. He stood beside Elena as she cleared the M107. He said nothing while she worked. When she set the rifle safely on the bench and straightened, he looked at her for a moment. "It's been a while," he said. "Yes, sir." "You didn't zero it." "No." "You were 4 clicks low on the optic. I watched your turret." 3.5, she said. "The barrel's broken in slightly differently than the standard spec. It runs a 1/4 click hot at distance." Hale looked at her for another second. "Right," he said. He turned to face the assembled group, Marines, contractors, journalists, the range staff, all of them standing in the particular stillness of people who have just recalibrated something significant about their understanding of the world. "Sergeant Major Kopech," Hale said. "Sir." "Get the file on Ms. Brooks and display it at the briefing station. He paused. Unredacted through her 2019 service record. That's as far as we can go publicly, but it's enough. Sir, that'll require your authorization every time someone accesses. Yes, it will. Hale didn't look away from the group. Display it anyway. And that was when the range learned why General Marcus Hale had known, from 300 meters and through desert heat shimmer and the unreliable filter of 11 years, exactly who the quiet woman at the end of the line was, and why he had told them to let her shoot. The file opened on the briefing station screen at 1447. Kopech typed the clearance code General Hale had provided, and the database populated slowly, pulling from multiple secured servers, documents appearing in sequence like cards being dealt face up onto a table. Name: Brooks, Elena Marie. Service: United States Army. Entered active duty 2004. Specialized training pipeline designated classified. Jurisdiction: JSOC. Long-range precision fire school. Graduated top of class 2006. Additional qualification: SOTIC, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Advanced Urban and Mountain Environment Qualification. Language Certification: Farsi. Functional Proficiency. Russian. Limited Working Proficiency. Deployments: 7, 6 classified. 1 partially declassified. Eastern Afghanistan, 2009 to 2011. Awards: the list was 11 entries long. Several were grayed out, replaced by black bars. Of the visible ones, a Bronze Star with Valor device, a second Bronze Star, a Meritorious Service Medal, 2 Army Commendation Medals, both with Valor. Confirmed engagements. The number was redacted, replaced by the notation, record maintained at SC level, not displayable at this clearance tier. And then, at the bottom of the declassified record, a single entry with a note attached. Long-range precision engagement record. Date classified. Location classified. Distance 3,149 meters. Conditions: high wind, low visibility, moving target. Outcome: confirmed. Methodology: validated by independent JTAC and subsequent satellite imagery. 3,149 meters, 1.96 miles. Reyes was the first one to say something. He said it quietly, to himself. But in the silence of the briefing area, it carried. That can't be real. It's real, Hale said from behind him. I was the theater commander when it happened. I signed the verification report. He let that sit. I want everyone here to understand something, Hale continued. That record, the shot, the confirmed engagement, the deployment history in that file, none of it happened in a stadium. None of it was witnessed by a crowd. Some of it happened in places you can't find on unclassified maps, in conditions that would have ended most careers before the first shot. And the operator who did all of that, he gestured toward Elena, who was standing at the edge of the group, her expression closed and still, walked onto this range today and registered as a civilian observer. She signed a standard liability waiver. She stood in the back of an orientation room and didn't correct a single assumption anyone made about her. He looked at Whitmore specifically, not harshly, just directly. That's not humility as a performance, Hale said. That's what genuine capability actually looks like. It doesn't need your attention. It doesn't need your permission. It just, he paused, operates. The briefing area was absolutely quiet. Elena was looking at the screen. Her expression had not changed, but something in her posture had shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening, the way a person's body responds to being seen when they've spent years making themselves invisible. Hale turned back to her. Sergeant Major Brooks, he said, using the rank she had not been called by in years, not by anyone in public, not in any room like this one. You have the range. She looked at him. For a moment, just a fraction, something moved across her face that wasn't quite visible and wasn't quite hidden. Something between discomfort and recognition. The look of a person who knows that being handed the room is both an honor and a kind of exposure she never trained herself to want. Then it was gone. She turned to the assembled group. The Marines, the contractors, the journalists who had lowered their phones without being asked a second time, the young Corporal Reyes, who was standing very straight. Let's talk about the shot, she said. Her voice was flat, practical. The voice of someone who taught things not because they enjoyed performing, but because they understood that the information mattered. She walked back to lane 7. Everyone followed. The desert heat was beginning to soften by the time she finished the first session, long shadows crawling east from the ridgeline and the orange-streaked light painting the lane markers in colors that almost made the place look peaceful. She had been talking for 45 minutes. Not about her record. Not about the file on the briefing station screen or the number at the bottom of it. She had talked about environmental reading, wind, mirage, atmospheric density, the way heat shimmer altered apparent target position at extreme distance. She had talked about the specific biomechanics of managing recoil in a way that preserved cheek weld through the shot cycle. She had demonstrated, with the Barrett unloaded, the difference between a trigger press done correctly and one done with anticipation, the almost invisible micro-flinch that could shift around 6 inches at distance. She was not trying to impress them. That was the thing that struck Reyes the most. He had been trained by good instructors and mediocre ones, and the mediocre ones always betrayed themselves by how much they needed you to understand that they knew things. Elena talked like someone who had been doing math for so long that the math had become language, natural, and unadorned. "The rifle doesn't care," she said at one point, when Corporal Tatum had asked about physical size and platform management. "I mean that literally, not as a figure of speech. The physics of the round in flight does not register your height, your weight, your gender, your career history. None of it. You feed it correct data or you don't. That's the only variable it responds to." "But the recoil," Tatum started. "The recoil is managed through position, not strength. Position is learnable. Strength is a shortcut that limits you." She looked at him evenly. "A 240-pound man fighting the recoil will shoot worse than a 130-pound woman riding it, every time." Tatum nodded slowly. "The rifle," she said, "is an equalizer. The problem is that people treat it like a test of something it was never designed to test." At the edge of the group, Whitmore had stopped doing anything except listening. He'd been there since the file came up on the briefing screen. He hadn't said a word. He was large and quiet and stood with his arms crossed, but not in the way he'd crossed them during orientation. That had been performance. This was something else. The posture of someone who is trying to take up less space. Elena noticed him. She didn't address him directly. She simply included him in the sweep of the room when she spoke, the same way she included everyone else, no more, no less. Which was, Reyes would later think, far more devastating than calling him out would have been. The session wrapped at 17:20. The light was going gold and warm, and the temperature had dropped 9 degrees in the last hour, which in Nevada desert terms was the equivalent of a gentle embrace. People dispersed. The journalists would have questions later. Hale's aide had already coordinated a brief information session with appropriate limitations. The contractors were quiet, both of them, in the reflective way of people recalibrating risk assessments. Gerald had shaken Elena's hand with a kind of reverence that probably embarrassed him in retrospect, said "thank you" twice, and walked toward the parking area. Reyes hung back. He waited until everyone else had cleared the lane before he walked to where Elena was loading the last of the inspection equipment back into the range case. She knew he was there. She didn't stop working. "I wanted to apologize," he said. You didn't say anything." "I laughed." She glanced at him, not unkindly. "People laugh at things they don't understand yet." He nodded. He stood there for a moment, not sure whether he was done. "The record," he said. "The 3,149. That's..." He shook his head. "Can I ask what the conditions were?" Elena closed the equipment case. "The conditions were bad," she said. "Yeah, but..." "That's the whole answer, Corporal." She stood up, adjusted the strap of her civilian duffel. "The conditions were bad, and the shot needed to happen, and it happened. The rest of it..." She looked at him steadily. "The rest of it is in a file that doesn't have my name on it. That's how it's supposed to be." She picked up her bag. "You're a good observer," she said. "The flag reading thing. You were watching me work it out. Not everyone would have caught that." Reyes blinked. Reyes. He hadn't expected to be evaluated. He hadn't expected anything from the conversation except to apologize and retreat. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. Then she walked toward the gate, the civilian gate, past the signs pointing in the wrong direction that she'd already figured out this morning on her way in. Reyes watched her go. Behind him, his radio crackled. Tatum's voice. "Hey, you see the secure bulletin board just updated? Something's been posted to the range notice system. Hale's office. Reyes, it's... You need to read this. Reyes pulled the radio from his belt. What is it? A pause. The kind that meant Tatum was reading and couldn't quite believe what he was reading. It's a training modification order, Tatum said. Effective immediately. All long-range qualification programs at Redstone they're being redesigned. And Reyes, yeah. They're naming the new standard after her. Reyes lowered the radio. He looked toward the gate, but Elena Brooks was already gone. The training modification order stayed on the secure bulletin board for exactly 48 hours before someone above Hale's pay grade quietly had it pulled. Not deleted, not reversed, just pulled. Moved to a pending administrative review queue where paperwork went to age without dying, which in military bureaucracy was a specific kind of killing that left no fingerprints. Reyes found out from Kopech, who found out from the range administrative clerk, who found out because she was the one who processed the removal request at 0600 on the third morning and had enough institutional memory to recognize that removal requests filed before the duty day officially started were rarely routine. Who filed it? Reyes asked. Kopech shrugged. Above my read level. Everything's above your read level lately. Yeah, well. Kopech looked at his coffee. Welcome to Redstone. They were in the break room off the main range building, early enough that the coffee was fresh, and the day hadn't gone wrong yet. Outside the single window, the desert was still purple-gray in the pre-dawn light, the ridgeline to the northeast just beginning to catch the first edge of orange. Does Brooks know? Reyes asked. About the pull? Kopech shook his head. She checked out of billeting at 0530, paid cash for the 2 nights, which, who pays cash for billeting anymore? And the front desk says she had a bag and a receipt for the bus depot. Reyes thought about that. She was already leaving, apparently, before the order got pulled. Before it got pulled, Kopech confirmed. He looked at Reyes with the expression of a man who had been in the army long enough to know exactly what this kind of sequence meant and had made a deliberate personal policy of not saying it out loud. Reyes drank his coffee. It was too hot, but he drank it anyway. Where's Hale? He asked. Gone. Left last night. Private transport. No itinerary filed with the center. Kopech paused. His aide left a number for administrative follow-up. That's it. So both of them are just gone. Yep. Kopech picked up his clipboard. Range opens in 40. You're on lane 3 for the morning block. He walked out. Reyes sat with his coffee in the cooling quiet of the break room and thought about a woman on a bus going somewhere that wasn't here, carrying a bag that wasn't heavy enough to hold everything she'd left behind. Elena was not on a bus. She was in a rental car, compact, silver, the kind of vehicle that disappeared in traffic because it was exactly like every other vehicle on the road, which was the point, driving south on US 95 through the flat and featureless mid-morning desert toward a meeting she had not agreed to, only been informed of. The call had come at 0415. Unknown number, which meant known number. The kind of unknown that had a specific texture to it, a silence before the first word that Elena recognized the way you recognized a voice you hadn't heard in years. You made the secure bulletin, the voice had said. I know. It's been pulled. I know that too. A pause. There are people who are unhappy about the file exposure, the unredacted portion. Hale authorized it. Hale authorized what he had authority to authorize. The threshold of what he had authority to authorize is being debated in a room he is not currently in. Elena had been standing at the window of her billeting room, looking at the dark shape of the parking lot and the pale stripe of the highway beyond the fence. She'd already been dressed, already had her bag packed. Decker, she said. Yes. What do they want? Another pause, longer, the kind that meant the answer was being chosen carefully. Colonel Nathan Decker had been her handler for the last 4 years of her active service and her primary point of contact in the years since. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had spent decades operating in spaces where honesty was a resource to be budgeted. There's a review, he said, informal. They want to talk to you about the range demonstration, the file access, and... He stopped. And what? And the 2019 matter. Elena was quiet for a moment. The 2019 matter has been closed for 5 years, she said. It's been filed for 5 years. That's not the same thing. She had looked at the highway. A single pair of headlights moving north, disappearing. "Where?" she said. He gave her coordinates. Not an address, coordinates. Which told her something about the nature of the meeting and the people running it. She'd checked out of billeting 20 minutes later. The coordinates resolved to a rest stop 37 miles south of Redstone that had been closed for renovation since the previous spring, according to a sun-bleached sign on a chain-link fence that someone had unlocked and relocked with a different padlock. Elena noticed the new padlock. She parked beside the only other vehicle in the lot, a black SUV with federal plates that weren't quite right, the kind of almost right that meant they'd passed a casual check, but wouldn't survive a close one. Two men were standing outside the SUV. Neither was Decker. One was mid-40s, heavy-set, in a dark suit that was wrong for the Nevada heat, in a way that suggested he'd come from somewhere with air conditioning and hadn't accounted for the transition. He had the specific bearing of someone who had never served, but had spent enough time around people who had to absorb certain mannerisms without their context. The other was younger, 30s, athletic, in utility clothing that was clean enough to be uncomfortable. He had a tablet under his arm and the watchful, slightly over-attentive posture of someone who was recording things. The suit spoke first. "Ms. Brooks, I'm Deputy Director Callum, Office of Defense Personnel Review." He said it the way people say titles when the title is doing work the explanation can't. "Thank you for meeting us." "You didn't give me an option," Elena said. "We gave you coordinates and a time. The decision to be here was yours." She looked at him steadily. "Where's Decker?" "Colonel Decker is available by phone if the conversation requires it." Callum gestured toward a concrete picnic structure at the edge of the lot that had been set up with folding chairs and a portable table. "Shall we?" Elena did not move immediately. She looked at the man with the tablet. "He records everything?" she said. "Standard documentation procedure." "Turn it off." Callum's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes. "Ms. Brooks, this is a formal review. Documentation is..." "Turn it off or I get back in the car." The man with the tablet looked at Callum. Callum looked at Elena for a moment, assessing, recalculating, and then gave a small nod. The tablet went into the SUV. The young man leaned against the vehicle with his arms folded and the expression of someone told to wait in a way that was clearly not optional. Elena walked to the picnic structure. Oh, Callum had a folder. Of course he had a folder. People like Callum always had folders because the folder communicated authority without requiring them to establish it through anything as unreliable as personal credibility. He opened it on the table between them and turned it so Elena could see the top page. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes on his face. "The file General Hale accessed at Redstone," Callum began. "The unredacted portion of your service record through 2019. I'm aware of what he accessed. The concern is that the access occurred in a semi-public setting. Multiple personnel present, some without sufficient clearance level to view portions of the material, even in summary form. Hale had authorization to access the file. The display of that file in an open briefing environment is a separate question." Callum's voice was measured, practiced, the voice of someone who had learned to sound reasonable while advancing unreasonable positions. "The individuals present, civilian contractors, journalists, Marine reservists without TS-SCI clearance. Their exposure to certain operational details creates a documentation requirement, a review requirement." "The bottom of the file listed a distance and an outcome," Elena said. "There was no location, no date, no target identification, no methodology beyond the summary notation. What exposure are you reviewing?" "The exposure of your identity as the operator associated with that notation." Silence. The desert around the rest stop was completely still in the late morning heat. No traffic on the highway. No wind. "That's not a security concern," Elena said. "That's something else." Callum's expression didn't change. "The review covers several areas. The range demonstration itself. The decision to request live-fire access at a civilian-adjacent event. The resulting attention. I registered through proper channels. Dot addendum. The clearance was in the system. Yes, the question is why the clearance was in the system. The civilian observer program doesn't typically accommodate, then your question is for whoever put it there." "Ms. Brooks." He shifted, just slightly. The 2019 matter. She had been waiting for it. She said nothing. The after-action record for the Eastern Corridor operation in November 2019 lists your designation in connection with an engagement that subsequently generated a formal complaint from the Theater Intelligence Office. A question of authorization scope, whether the engagement fell within the operational parameters as defined by the mission brief. He looked at her carefully. The complaint was filed. The file was closed administratively, but the underlying question of authorization was never formally resolved. It was closed, Elena said. It was deferred. 5 years ago. Deferred reviews don't expire, Ms. Brooks. He folded his hands on the folder. What we'd like to understand is whether the events at Redstone, the file access, the demonstration, the subsequent training modification order, were connected to any effort to reopen or relitigate the 2019 matter in an unofficial capacity. Elena looked at him for a long moment. You think I went to Redstone to make a case for myself, she said. We're asking whether I went to Redstone, she said, because I registered for the Civilian Observer Program 8 weeks ago for personal reasons that have nothing to do with 2019 or any review or your office or Hale's training modification. I registered, I attended, I was asked to demonstrate by an authorized general officer, and I demonstrated. That's the complete sequence. And General Hale's presence at Redstone on the same day is a coincidence you're welcome to investigate. She stood up. I've answered the questions. You have my contact information through Decker. If there's a formal review convened, I'll attend with legal representation. If this was the formal review, you'll want to put that in writing. Callum stood as well, slower, the movement of a man who had not expected the conversation to end this quickly. Ms. Brooks, the 2019 engagement was authorized. Her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It simply became, in a way that was more unsettling than anger, completely flat. It was authorized by the JTAC on the ground, confirmed by Theater Command within 6 hours, and the complaint was filed by an intelligence officer who had a personal and professional conflict with the mission lead, and who has since been separated from service for unrelated conduct violations. You already know all of that. It's in the same file you're holding. Callum said nothing. So when you say the authorization question was never formally resolved, Elena continued, what you mean is that someone with enough reach to pull a training modification order at 0-dark-30 also has enough reach to keep a 5-year-old deferred complaint warm as a pressure instrument, and you're here to apply it. The desert was very quiet. Callum closed the folder. We'll be in touch, he said. Elena walked to her car. She drove for 2 hours before she stopped. Not because she was tired, she was not tired, but because somewhere around the 40-mile mark, she had become aware that the black SUV with the almost right plates was maintaining a distance of approximately 3/4 of a mile behind her, close enough to track, far enough to deny it was tracking. She drove for another 90 minutes to see if it would drop off. It didn't. She stopped at a gas station in a town that was mostly a gas station and a grain elevator, and the memory of a population that had moved somewhere else. She filled the tank. She bought a bottle of water and a package of crackers that tasted like the cardboard they came in. The SUV stopped on the far side of the highway and did not refuel. She ate the crackers standing beside her car, looking at the mountains to the west. They were the color of old rust in the midday heat, the kind of landscape that looked nothing like the eastern Afghanistan mountains she'd operated in for 2 years, but had the same quality of vast and uncaring distance, the same way of making human problems feel temporary. Her phone rang. It was not an unknown number this time. It was Decker's actual number. She answered. They found you quickly, he said. No preamble. He'd always hated preamble. They knew where I was going, which means they knew where you sent me, which means the call last night was either monitored or you told them. A pause. The call was monitored. I didn't tell them. Distinction without difference, Nathan. Elena, is the 2019 file actually in play? Silence on the line, long enough to be its own answer. Someone petitioned the Defense Review Board 6 weeks ago, he said finally. Formal re-examination request. I found out 4 days ago. I'm telling you now because the Redstone situation accelerated their timeline. Who petitioned? The name on the petition is a law firm. The firm has clients I can't identify through open channels. But you have a guess. I have a guess, he said carefully. that involves someone who was present at the Eastern Corridor in 2019 and who has spent the intervening years building a case that your engagement was outside authorization scope in a way that creates personal liability for the mission lead. A pause. Which creates liability for you. Elena was quiet. Across the highway, the SUV sat in the heat shimmer like a dark stone. The shot was clean, Nathan. I know it was clean. The JTAC called it. The geometry was, I know. His voice was tired. Not tired of her, tired of the thing they were describing. Elena, it doesn't matter if the shot was clean. It matters who's asking the question. And right now, the person asking the question has resources and a 5-year head start on building a narrative. She looked at the mountains. The mission lead, she said. Is he aware of the petition? A pause that she read immediately. Nathan. Major David Carver was separated from service in 2021 under a fitness evaluation process that he has consistently characterized as retaliation. Decker stopped. He died 8 months ago, cardiac event. He was 54. Elena closed her eyes briefly, opened them. The mountains were still there. Then why is someone petitioning on his behalf? She said. They're not petitioning on his behalf. They're petitioning for a formal finding that the engagement was unauthorized, which… Decker paused. Elena, a formal finding like that has implications beyond your service record. Depending on how it's classified, it could be actionable in a civil context. They want to sue me. They want to create the finding that makes the suit viable. The petition is the first step. She said nothing for a moment. The crackers were still in her hand. She looked at them with a kind of distant, practical disbelief. That she was standing in a forgotten town in Nevada eating cardboard crackers while someone she'd never met was constructing a legal architecture around the worst night of her professional life. The man I shot in 2019, she said. Her voice was very controlled. He had a name in our file. Nasir Khalil. He had a different name in the intelligence record. He had coordinates, a pattern of life assessment, a threat classification at level 4. She paused. He also had 17 people in a basement 40 meters from his position who were 11 minutes from being executed. The JTAC had eyes on all of it. The clock was… Elena. Decker's voice was quiet. I know. Then they know. Yes, and it doesn't matter. A long pause. Because what they're disputing isn't whether the people in the basement were saved. It's whether you had the specific authorization to take the shot at that specific moment under the mission brief as written. And the mission brief… He stopped. The mission brief didn't cover the basement, she said. No, it didn't. The weight of that settled between them on the phone line, heavy and familiar. The weight of a thing known for 5 years and now being carried in a new way. What do you need from me? She said. I need you to stay findable. Don't do anything that looks like you're avoiding the review. And I need you to think carefully about whether there's anyone from the Eastern Corridor, the 2019 team, who would put their name on a supporting statement. He paused. Someone who was there. Elena thought about the people who had been there, the faces, the call signs, the way voices sounded in radio headsets at 2 in the morning in a place without electricity. She thought about which of those people were still reachable, still willing, still alive. I'll think about it, she said. There's something else, Decker said. She waited. The petition. It was filed 6 weeks ago. He was choosing his words very carefully now. Callum's office opened the Redstone file 2 days ago, which is after the bulletin board modification order posted. But their documentation on you, the background material they had in that folder, some of it predates Redstone by months. Movement history, civilian registration records, the Observer Program registration. Elena looked at the SUV across the highway. They were already watching me before Redstone, she said. Yes. Then Redstone wasn't the trigger for the review. Redstone was an opportunity, Decker said, to make contact in a context that looked procedural. She put the crackers in her pocket. She looked at the gas station, the grain elevator, the mountains, and the black vehicle on the far side of a road that went on in both directions toward versions of the same problem. Nathan, she said, the person behind the petition, your guess. A long pause. You remember the Eastern Corridor intelligence officer, he said, the one whose conduct complaint got closed along with the 2019 file. Harlan Voss, she said. He was separated from service. He was not removed from consulting relationships. He has been attached to a private defense advisory firm since 2020. Decker paused. The law firm that filed the petition has that firm as a client. Elena stood very still in the gas station heat. Harlan Voss. She remembered him the way she remembered specific problems, not with emotion, but with precision. The shape of his face in a briefing room. The way he had looked at her after the engagement, not with the careful neutrality of someone filing a formal complaint, but with the expression of a man who had decided something. She had thought, at the time, that it was over. She had been wrong. "I'll be in touch," she said, and ended the call. She got in the car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine off, watching the heat move in waves off the asphalt. Then she started the car and pulled back onto the highway. The SUV across the road waited 45 seconds before it followed. She drove northeast. Not because northeast was the plan. She hadn't had a plan when she pulled out of the gas station, only the instinct that sitting still was the worst available option. But northeast took her away from the SUV's likely base of operations, away from the Reno corridor where Callum's office would have contacts, and toward terrain she knew from 3 separate training rotations in the early part of her career. High desert transitioning to broken country, the kind of geography where a vehicle following at 3/4 of a mile became visible before it became a problem. The SUV stayed with her for 40 minutes before it dropped off near a junction town called Mineral Creek that was 4 buildings and a water tower. She watched it in the mirror, the distant dark shape slowing, pulling onto a side road, disappearing. She didn't assume it was done. She assumed it had handed her off to something she couldn't see yet, which was worse. She drove for another hour with the radio off and the windows cracked, thinking. The 2019 Eastern Corridor operation had involved 8 people total, 4 operators including herself, a 2-man JTAC element, and 2 intelligence personnel embedded with the mission, one of whom had been Harlan Voss, and the other a signals analyst named Petrie, whose last name she remembered and whose face she remembered less clearly, which said something about how unremarkable Petrie had been, even in a situation designed to make people remarkable. Voss had not been unremarkable. He'd been the kind of intelligence officer who treated operators as variables in his analytical framework rather than as people with operational judgment. He'd briefed the Eastern Corridor mission with the particular confidence of someone who had never been in a position to be wrong in a way that cost blood. He had a pattern of life assessment on Nasir Khalil that was thorough and almost entirely useless in the moment actually arrived. The basement had not been in Voss's assessment. 17 people, women and children mostly, with a handful of men who were too old or too injured to be of interest to anyone with a weapon. They'd been moved there in the 72 hours before the operation, which told Elena something about Khalil's operational awareness that Voss's assessment had missed entirely. Khalil had known or suspected something was coming. He'd set himself up in the position of being a human shield, not for himself, but for the people below him, using their lives as a negotiating layer that the mission brief had never been designed to navigate. The JTAC, a staff sergeant named Ortega, who had the kind of operational calm that came from having been in worse situations than this, and surviving them through pure grinding competence, had seen the geometry immediately. He'd called it over the radio in a voice that was completely flat, which was how Elena had known it was as bad as it sounded. Bravo 1, I have eyes on 17 non-combatants, basement level, 40 meters. Target is elevated position, has line of sight on the extraction route. Your window is... Ortega had done the math aloud, which was something he only did when the math was very tight. 11 minutes before the southern element's cover is compromised. Call it. She'd called it. The mission brief hadn't covered the basement scenario because the intelligence hadn't known the basement existed. Authorization scope in a situation the intelligence hadn't anticipated was a gray area that military lawyers had been arguing about in various forms for as long as military lawyers had existed. Voss had filed his complaint within 18 hours of the operation's completion. He'd characterized the engagement as outside authorization scope without disclosing, in his initial complaint documentation, that the JTAC had verbally authorized and that his own intelligence assessment had failed to identify the civilian concentration at risk. The complaint had been filed fast enough that it looked like it had been pre-written, which, Elena had always suspected, it had been. The complaint had been administratively closed because Ortega's radio log existed, because the satellite imagery confirmed the geometry, and because a second review of Voss's assessment had found 3 specific intelligence failures that had shaped the mission conditions in ways Voss had not disclosed to the mission brief team. But closed was not gone. Decker had been right about that. In the filing system of institutional memory, closed was just a door with a lock that certain people had keys to. She pulled over on the shoulder of a state route she'd turned onto 20 minutes earlier, took out her phone, and called a number she hadn't called in 2 years. It rang 6 times before it picked up. Yeah. The voice was rough and morning low. Even though it was past noon, the voice of someone who worked nights or simply didn't see a reason to adjust his vocal register for the time of day. Ortega, she said. A pause. She could hear him shifting, sitting up maybe, or moving to a different room. Then, Brooks. You've been contacted, she said. It wasn't a question. Another pause, this one confirmatory. 2 weeks ago, a woman from a law firm said she was doing preliminary research on a defense review matter and wanted to ask me some questions about standard JTAC authorization protocols in a general capacity. He said general capacity with the inflection of someone who had recognized exactly what it meant and had ended the call promptly. You didn't talk to her. I told her I wasn't in a position to discuss operational matters and suggested she submit a formal request through JAG channels, which is the thing you say when you want to tell someone to go to hell in a way that doesn't give them anything to use. A pause. Is this the 2019 thing? Yes. Voss. Through a law firm, through a private advisory firm he's been with since separation. Ortega was quiet for a moment. She could hear the particular quality of his silence, the kind that meant he was thinking fast and keeping the thinking off his face, which was a habit from fieldwork that persisted even when there was no face to keep it off. They went after you, he said. They're building a formal finding that the engagement was outside authorization scope. My radio log is 5 years old and was processed through a system that Voss has had 5 years to cultivate relationships in. She looked at the empty road ahead. They're not disputing that you authorized it, Ortega. They're disputing whether your authorization was within your operational scope given the mission brief parameters. That's... He stopped. She could hear him working through it. That's threading a very thin needle. Thin needles are what lawyers are for. So what do you need? A formal statement, your account of the authorization call, the geometry, the timeline, the civilian situation as you observed it from your position. She paused. Submitted through JAG channels as a responding document to the petition. I can do that, he said immediately. No hesitation. It might not be enough, and it puts your name in the record in connection with the review. My name is already in the record, Brooks. It's in the radio log. A pause. Did you call me to ask me to do it, or to give me a chance to say no? She thought about that. Both, she said. I'll do it. His voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of a man settling a debt he'd always known was there. Petrie was there too. Petrie was signals. He wasn't in position to observe the geometry. No, but he heard Voss in the vehicle after, heard him on the phone. Ortega paused. Said Voss was on this line with someone at the theater intelligence office within an hour of the operation completing, before the after-action review, before the formal debrief, which is not standard. Elena went still. Petrie told you this. Told me 6 months after the fact, over a beer, in the way people tell you things when they've been carrying them. He didn't file anything. He didn't think it would matter, since the complaint got closed. Ortega paused. If the complaint is being reopened, it matters. Can you reach Petrie? I can try. Do that, she said. And Ortega, yeah. Watch your back. They were following me. If they're building a case, you're a priority witness in both directions. Understood. A pause. You okay? She considered the question with the particular detachment of someone who hadn't been asked it in a while and wasn't entirely sure how to run the assessment. I'm working on it, she said. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and the desert around her absolutely still, and then she started driving again. She found a motel in a town called Elko that was large enough to have 3 motels and small enough that none of them had cameras covering the parking lot. She paid cash, took a room on the ground floor with a window that faced the service road, and spent an hour doing something she hadn't done in 5 years. She wrote it all down. Not on her phone. On paper, with a pen she'd bought at the gas station, in the tight and deliberate handwriting she'd developed during operations when notes had to be legible in low light and brief enough to be destroyed quickly. She wrote the sequence of the Eastern Corridor operation from her first briefing through the engagement through the after-action process. Names, times, positions, the exact language of Ortega's authorization call as she remembered it, the exact geometry of the shot as she had calculated it, the 17 people in the basement and the 11-minute window and the specific chain of decisions that had produced a particular outcome in a particular place on a particular night. She wrote Voss's behavior, what she'd observed, what Ortega had described, the phone call that Petrie had overheard. She wrote it in the way that a person who has had training in documentation writes it, without editorializing, without narrative framing, in the functional language of operational record-keeping. The language of someone who knew that the most dangerous thing you could put in a document was anything that looked like emotion. When she finished, she read it back once. Then she took the papers, folded them into an envelope she'd bought at the gas station, addressed it to Decker's office using a code address that had been established for exactly this kind of contingency, and set it on the nightstand. She would mail it in the morning. She slept 4 hours, badly, in the way she had learned to sleep in the field, not resting exactly, but running the engine at a lower speed. She woke at 2 in the morning with the complete and immediate awareness of someone trained to move from sleep to functional in under 30 seconds, sat up in the dark, and listened. Nothing. Wind against the window. A truck on the main road. She lay back down and did not sleep again. But the call came at 6:47. Decker. His actual number, which now meant something different than it had yesterday. "There's a situation," he said. She was already dressed. "Tell me." "The petition to the Defense Review Board has been expedited. They filed an emergency motion 48 hours ago citing new evidence." He paused. "Elena, they've pulled the JTAC radio logs from the 2019 operation, the full logs. And they filed a motion arguing that the specific authorization language Ortega used in his call, the verbal authorization, was procedurally deficient under the mission brief parameters because the mission brief required written command authorization for any engagement that deviated from the planned operational scope." She was quiet for a moment. "The written authorization requirement," she said. "Yes. Which is standard language in mission briefs that no one has ever applied to a JTAC verbal authorization in the history of operating under contact. Which is why it's never been tested in a formal review setting." Decker's voice was careful. "Elena, if the board accepts this argument, if they find that Ortega's verbal authorization was procedurally deficient, then the engagement is categorically unauthorized regardless of the outcome, regardless of the geometry, regardless of the people in the basement." She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. "They don't care about winning the argument on the merits," she said. "They care about creating the finding. For civil liability purposes, yes. A board finding of unauthorized engagement is, Nathan," her voice cut across his, "where is this being heard?" A pause. "The review board convenes in 48 hours, Denver field office. And they've already served me with notice through Callum. Callum's office filed the notification last night. It would have been transmitted to your registered contact address." He paused. "Which is your old Virginia address." "Which I haven't lived at for 2 years." "Yes." "So they notified an address they know is current, because they have a movement file on me, while simultaneously filing to a prior address to argue that notification was served, and I didn't respond." The silence on the line was its own kind of answer. "Nathan," she said, "who has the authority to expedite a Defense Review Board motion?" "At the level required for this timeline." He paused. "A flag officer with connections to the DPRO, or a civilian with equivalent influence in the defense personnel system?" "Callum. Callum's a deputy director. He has influence, not command authority." Another pause. "But the firm that filed the petition has at least 3 retired flag officers on its advisory board." She sat down on the edge of the motel bed. This was the moment. She recognized it with the specific clarity she'd learned to trust over years in situations where the geometry mattered more than the fear, where the problem stopped being a bureaucratic inconvenience and became something structured, deliberate, coordinated across more than one level of a system that most people assumed was impartial. Most people had not spent a significant portion of their adult life understanding how systems failed. She thought about 48 hours. She thought about Denver. She thought about what it would cost to appear before a review board that had been pre-shaped by people who controlled the timeline and the evidence framework. Without legal representation she could trust in the time available, without the documents she'd mailed to Decker that wouldn't arrive for 2 more days. And she thought about something else, something Decker had said in a different conversation a year ago, a passing reference that she'd filed and not retrieved until now. "Nathan," she said, "the advisory firm Voss works for, Meridian Defense Group." "Yes." "Meridian has federal contracts." "Several. Mostly analytical support and advisory." "They have a DoD training support contract," she said. "I read the contract summary in a defense procurement bulletin 8 months ago. It was a renewal. The original contract was awarded in 2021. She paused. The contracting officer who approved the original award was Major David Carver. The silence on the line lasted a long time. "Carver was the mission lead in 2019, Decker said slowly, "and he was separated in 2021 under what Voss apparently characterized as retaliation." She kept her voice flat, procedural, the voice she used when she needed to think in straight lines. "But the contract approval went through before the separation, which means Carver awarded a federal contract to the firm where Voss would later be employed, months before Voss filed the renewed petition, months before Carver died." "Elena, it's not a coincidence, Nathan. It's a quid pro quo with a 5-year fuse. Carver approved the contract. The contract provided Voss with resources and institutional cover. Voss used those resources to build the petition. And now that Carver is dead, there's no one left to ask about the contract approval." She paused. "That's why the timing matters. That's why the petition was filed after Carver died. He was the loose end." Decker was silent for what felt like a long time. "If you can document that chain," he started. "I can document part of it. The contract is public record. The timeline is public record. Carver's approval signature is on file." She stood up. "What's not public is Voss's behavior in the vehicle after the operation, which is why Petrie matters. I'll push Ortega on the Petrie contact. Do more than push. And Nathan, she picked up the envelope from the nightstand. "I'm mailing you something. It needs to be in your office before the board convenes. Get it there by private courier if the mail won't make it." "What is it?" "My account of the 2019 operation. Complete. Everything I remember." A pause. "Elena, if you submit that to a board proceeding without an attorney reviewing it, I know the risks." She picked up her bag. "I also know what happens if I let a pre-shaped review proceed without putting my account in the record before it closes. The risk of silence is worse." She could hear him breathing. The particular breathing of a man who had spent a career making hard assessments and had learned that the moment you stopped making them honestly was the moment you became useless to the people who needed you. "All right," he said. "I'll arrange the courier." A pause. "What are you going to do?" She looked around the motel room, the bare walls, the thin curtains, the morning light coming in gray and flat through the window facing the service road. "I'm going to Denver," she said. "The hearing is in 48 hours. If you show up without counsel, I'm not going to the hearing." She zipped her bag. "Not yet. I'm going to find someone who was at the Eastern Corridor and who hasn't been reached yet, someone whose account Voss hasn't had 5 years to prepare for." "Who?" She thought about the 8 people, the 4 operators, the 2 JTAC personnel, Ortega, and his observer, a lance corporal named Ferris, who had been 22 and very quiet, and had the photographic memory that made certain people exactly the kind of witness that certain lawyers spent careers trying to preempt. "Ferris," she said. Decker paused. "The junior JTAC observer." He had eyes on the whole sequence, different angle than Ortega, corroborating position. She paused. "He got out in 2022. Last known address was Colorado Springs. Denver was 90 minutes from Colorado Springs." "You think Voss's people haven't found him?" Decker said. "I think he was a lance corporal who was present as a subordinate and whose name appears in the operational record as LCPL Ferris OBS without a full first name on the unredacted portions. He's not an obvious target." She paused. "Yet." "Elena, I know." She picked up the envelope in her bag and moved to the door. "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" She stopped with her hand on the door handle. The question was fair, and she knew it was fair, and the fairness of it sat in her chest with a weight that wasn't quite discomfort and wasn't quite something else. "I'm doing the only thing I know how to do," she said. "I'm reading the geometry and making the call." She opened the door. The morning was cold and clean, and the sky over Elko was the pale, washed-out blue of altitude and early hour, and the parking lot was empty except for her silver rental car and a pickup belonging to someone in the room at the far end. No black SUV. Which meant either they'd given up or they'd gotten better. She walked to the car. She found Ferris at 11:43 in the morning at a machine shop on the south edge of Colorado Springs that did precision metalwork for a mix of civilian and light industrial clients. His name was on the business, Ferris Precision, hand-lettered on a sign above the door that had been repainted at some point, but not recently. The kind of business built on competence and sustained on repetition, the kind that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. The shop smelled like cutting oil and steel dust. A CNC machine was running in the back. A man was at the front bench doing something careful with a caliper, and he looked up when the door opened and his face went through three things very fast: recognition, surprise, and the particular controlled flattening of expression that was specific to people who had spent time in operational environments and learned to manage their reactions before their reactions managed them. He was 31 now. He'd put on maybe 20 pounds from his service weight, all of it useful, and he had the hands of someone who worked with precision tools and took it seriously. He looked at Elena for a moment. Then he set down the caliper. "I wondered if you'd come," he said. She stopped. "You knew?" "Didn't know it would be you. Figured somebody would eventually." He wiped his hands on a shop rag. "A woman called 3 days ago. Said she was doing background research. Asked about my service record in a general way." He paused. "I told her I didn't talk about service matters, and hung up." "Good." "Is it bad?" he said. "They're trying to get a formal, unauthorized engagement finding from the Defense Review Board. 48 hours. He looked at her steadily. Behind him, the CNC machine ran its cycle, oblivious. "The authorization call," he said. "They're arguing it was procedurally deficient because Ortega's verbal authorization deviated from the written mission brief parameters." Ferris was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the bench. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I was on the ANPRC that night," he said. "The frequency log." "I know." "Every transmission Ortega made was logged, time-stamped." He paused. "There's a transmission at 22:41. That's 9 minutes before you're shot. That transmission is Ortega on the command net, not the tactical net. The command net, getting confirmation from the theater operations center." He looked at her. "Not just the verbal authorization to me and you on tactical, a separate command net contact." Elena went very still. "That transmission would be in the full radio log," she said. "Yes." "Which they pulled." "Which they pulled. So if it's in the log, it's in the log," she said. "But a transmission on the command net could have been anything. A status update, a position report. Without the content, I logged the content," Ferris said, "in my observation record. I wrote it down because I was 22 and I'd been told to write everything down, and I was the kind of person who actually did what I was told." He almost smiled. Ortega reached the theater ops center. He described the situation, the civilians, the geometry, the window. The ops center duty officer authorized expanded engagement scope verbally. Ortega acknowledged. "I logged the exchange verbatim." He paused. "Including the duty officer's identification number." Elena looked at him. "You have the observation log," she said. "I have the observation log." He pushed off the bench and walked to a steel cabinet in the corner, turned a combination, opened it. He reached past several items she didn't look at too closely and produced a document envelope that was old enough to have yellowed at the edges. He held it out to her. She didn't take it immediately. "Ferris," she said, "if I take that, it becomes part of a formal record. Your name goes into a board proceeding." "I know." "They will come at you. Not Voss personally, but his people. They'll dig into your service record, your business, your—" "Ms. Brooks." His voice was even and quiet and carried the particular weight of someone who had made a decision before this conversation started. "I was 22 years old in a ditch in the dark, watching the clock run down on 17 people. And the only thing standing between those people and what was about to happen to them was you taking a shot that I watched through my scope and that I logged in real time. He paused. I've been running that machine shop for 4 years. I do good work. I pay my taxes. I am a completely unremarkable civilian. Another pause. The least I can do is tell the truth about a night that was a lot less unremarkable than my current situation. He held out the envelope. She took it. The paper was dry and slightly brittle, and the handwriting inside, she checked, briefly, just the first page, was the tight and careful handwriting of someone who had understood that the record was the record and had treated it accordingly. The duty officer's identification number, she said. Do you know if he's still... I looked him up 3 days ago, when the woman called. Ferris went back to his bench, picked up the caliper. He's at Fort Carson, CW4 now. I have his name written on the back of the last page. She looked at him. He shrugged. I figured somebody would eventually come, he said again. She put the envelope in her bag. Outside, the Colorado Springs morning was cold and clear, and the mountains to the west were sharp and white against a sky so blue it looked manufactured. She sat in the silver rental car with the document envelope in her bag and the name of a warrant officer at Fort Carson on the last page of a 22-year-old's field log, and she understood with the completeness of someone reading a map that the geometry had shifted, not resolved, not finished, but shifted. The shot had been authorized, not just by Ortega on the tactical net, but by the Theater Operations Center on the command net, logged by an observer who had kept his notes for 9 years without knowing if they would ever matter. Which meant the petition's central argument that the authorization was procedurally deficient was built on an incomplete picture of the record, which meant someone had pulled the radio logs and chosen not to see the command net transmission, or chosen not to disclose it. She took out her phone and called Decker. I have something, she said when he picked up. Talk to me. The 2241 transmission in Ortega's command net log. Pull it. Not the tactical log, the command net log. It's a separate frequency. And look for a duty officer identification number. I'll have the number for you in 10 minutes. A pause. Elena, how did you... Ferris kept his observation log. She started the car. All of it. Verbatim. The silence on the line lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing. If the command net transmission shows Theater Ops Center verbal authorization with a duty officer confirmation number, he said slowly, then the procedural deficiency argument falls apart. Completely, she said. And whoever pulled the radio logs for the petition and didn't flag the command net transmission either missed it or buried it. If they buried it, then this isn't just a civil liability move, Elena said. It's evidence tampering in a formal review proceeding. She pulled out of the Ferris Precision lot onto the southbound road. Fort Carson was 40 minutes from here. The mountains were very clear and very close, and the road was straight, and she drove it without looking in the mirror because, for the first time since Callum had sat across from her at a concrete picnic table in a closed rest stop and told her the 2019 matter was back, she was no longer reacting. She was operating. Chief Warrant Officer 4. Raymond Doss did not look like a man who expected company. He was at his desk in a shared office at Fort Carson's Operations Support Building when Elena arrived, eating a sandwich over a topographic printout with the focused indifference of someone who had learned to eat at his desk because leaving the desk meant the desk would be worse when he returned. He was 53, lean in the face, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the slightly distracted bearing of a man whose primary relationship was with information systems rather than people. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. She showed him her old DoD identification, the one that technically should have been surrendered at separation, but that Decker had flagged as administratively retained for ongoing matters, which was a category that existed primarily because certain situations required it. Doss looked at it, looked at her, and set his sandwich down. Ms. Brooks, he said, you know who I am. Someone called me an hour ago, told me you might be coming. He took off his reading glasses entirely. Told me what you'd be asking about. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. Decker. Yes. Doss folded his hands on the topographic printout. He had the hands of someone who typed a great deal and had done other things with them before that. He told me about the board petition, the 2241 transmission. You remember it. It wasn't a question. People who were duty officers in operations centers on nights where authorization calls came in. Under contact didn't forget those calls. The nature of the memory wasn't emotional. It was the precision of someone who had been trained to log things exactly and whose brain had therefore retained them with the same fidelity. November 14th, 2019, Doss said, 2241 local, incoming on the command net, Eastern Corridor frequency. He looked at her steadily. Staff Sergeant Ortega. He identified himself, gave his unit designation, described the situation on the ground. Non-combatant concentration, 40 meters offset from target position, 17 individuals, estimated window of 11 minutes before the Southern element's concealment was compromised. He paused. He asked for authorization to expand engagement scope beyond the planned target set. And you authorized it. I authorized it, verbally. Standard command net protocol for time-critical situations where written authorization is physically impossible. I logged the authorization in the Ops Center duty record with my identification number and a timestamp. He paused. I also flagged it for the senior watch officer who countersigned the log entry within the hour. Elena was quiet for a moment. The petition to the Defense Review Board, she said. They pulled the radio logs. Did anyone contact you about the Ops Center duty record? The log entry? Doss looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. A careful, precise shift. The look of a man who has been thinking about something for several days and has not yet said it aloud. No, he said. No one from the DPRO, no one from a law firm. No one. He paused. Which I found interesting, since if you're making a procedural deficiency argument about an authorization call, the Ops Center duty record is the first place you look. It's not obscure. It's in the same archival system as the radio logs. He unfolded his hands and laid them flat on the desk. Someone either didn't look or looked and decided not to include what they found. If they found it and didn't disclose it to the board, then they submitted an incomplete evidentiary record to a formal proceeding. His voice was flat and careful. Which has a name. Yes, Elena said. It does. Doss picked up his sandwich, looked at it, and put it back down. What do you need from me? A certified copy of the duty log entry, your written statement confirming the authorization call, the content of the exchange, and the counter-signature by the senior watch officer. She paused. And the name of the senior watch officer. Lieutenant Colonel Petra Sandoval. She retired in 2023. I have her contact information. He opened a desk drawer. I've been keeping it because... He stopped. Because you thought this might come back. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to say the complete version of a thing. When the 2019 complaint was filed, he said, someone from the Theater Intelligence Office contacted the Ops Center about the duty log, asked about the record-keeping procedures, whether duty log entries from that operational period were routinely archived or selectively archived. He paused. The person who called was identified by an extension registered to the Theater Intelligence Office's senior analyst. He paused again. I don't know who Harlan Voss is. Elena said nothing. But the call came from his extension, Doss said, 4 days after the engagement. She looked at him. You never reported that, she said. The complaint was administratively closed. The matter appeared to be resolved. He met her eyes steadily. I am reporting it now, said. Decker's courier met her at a FedEx location in Colorado Springs at 4 in the afternoon. A woman in civilian clothes who produced the right verification code and took the envelope Elena had mailed from Elko, plus the certified copy of Doss's duty log entry and the written statement that Doss had produced in 40 minutes using the professional economy of a man who had written operational documentation for 30 years. Elena added a handwritten cover note with Sandoval's contact information and Doss's account of the 2019 inquiry call from Voss's extension. The courier left. Elena sat in her car in the FedEx parking lot and called Decker. It's in motion, she said. I know. Doss called me directly after you left. He's filing a formal disclosure with the board. The duty log entry, the inquiry call, all of it. Decker's voice had changed. Not dramatically. Decker didn't do dramatic. But there was something in it that had loosened slightly, the way a wire sounds different when the tension drops from critical to manageable. Elena, if the board receives Doss's disclosure before the hearing convenes, they'll have to acknowledge the Ops Center record. They can't hear the procedural deficiency argument without addressing an authorization log that directly contradicts it. More than that, if the board determines that the petitioner's legal team had access to the archival system and didn't disclose the duty log entry, he paused. The board chair can refer the matter to the DOJ. That's not a finding, that's a referral, which is a different animal entirely. Elena looked at the FedEx building. A man was loading packages into a van. A woman was arguing on the phone. Normal civilian life proceeding at its normal civilian pace. Is Voss's firm aware of DOS? She said. They will be when the disclosure hits the board's docket. That's... He checked something. 18 hours before the hearing. Not enough time to react properly. No. They'll try to pull the hearing. Continuance request. Probably. Decker paused. The board chair is Colonel Miriam Tate. She doesn't grant continuances without cause, and we didn't know about this evidence is not cause when the evidence was in the same system they used to pull the radio logs. Elena had not heard of Colonel Miriam Tate, but the description was enough. What about Ortega? She said. Statement submitted through JAG channels this afternoon. Complete, detailed. And Elena. He included a notation that Petrie had contacted him about the post-operation call Voss made. He paused. Petrie submitted his own statement 2 hours ago. He found a JAG officer at his base independently. Apparently Ortega called him, and he didn't need much convincing. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Ferris? She said. Ferris drove to Denver this afternoon and hand-delivered his observation log to the board's intake office, in person, with a copy of his discharge record and a business card. Decker's voice had something in it that was almost but not quite warmth. The intake clerk apparently told him it was unusual to submit documents in person, and Ferris told her that unusual was fine with him. Elena said nothing for a moment. These men didn't have to do any of that, she said. No, Decker said. They didn't. The parking lot was quiet. The man with the packages had driven away. The board hearing, she said. Should I be there? A pause. You're entitled to attend. You're not required. He paused again. Elena, there's a scenario where the board reviews the evidentiary record, finds the disclosure compelling, and dismisses the petition without requiring your appearance. In that scenario, your attendance adds nothing procedurally and gives Callum's office footage of you at a formal proceeding that they can use to frame a narrative about the investigation. And the scenario where they don't dismiss. Then you're there, prepared, with counsel. He paused. I've arranged representation. An attorney named Walsh, who does exactly this kind of work, and who has reviewed the summary I sent her. She's in Denver. She wants to meet with you tonight if you can get there. I can get there? Good. A pause. There's one more thing. She waited. Callum, he said. His office has been informed of the DOS disclosure, informally, through a channel I won't specify. His office has gone quiet. No new filings, no contact, no SUV on anyone's tail as of the last 2 hours. Decker's voice was precise. That's not resolution. That's recalibration. He's waiting to see how the board moves. And Voss? Voss, as of this afternoon, is on a flight from D.C. to Denver. A pause. He booked it 4 hours ago. Elena absorbed that. He's going to the hearing, she said. He's going to something in Denver. The hearing is one possibility. Decker's voice was careful. Elena, Voss is not a passive actor in this. He's been building this case for 5 years. Whatever happens at the board hearing tomorrow, he will not simply accept the outcome if it goes against him. He has resources, he has relationships in the system, and he has, by all indications, a significant amount of personal investment in the result. She thought about what personal investment looked like on a man she'd seen in a briefing room in 2019 and never since. The face she'd filed under problem and assumed was resolved. The look of a man who had decided something. Why, she said. Voss, what does he actually want? Decker was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that, he said. The civil liability angle is real, but it's not. The damages in a case like this would be limited. You're not a wealthy target. The legal cost of pursuing it would likely exceed any realistic recovery. He paused. What Voss lost when he was separated from service wasn't money. It was standing. He'd built his career on being the intelligence officer who had the best read on the battlefield. And the 2019 operation produced an outcome that his assessment had not predicted and could not have produced without an operator making a call his framework hadn't included. He paused again. You made him wrong in a way that was documented and reviewed and filed. And then the complaint he filed, his attempt to reframe the narrative, was closed, which made him wrong again. So this is about the record, Elena said. It's about the version of events that gets stamped and filed permanently, Decker said. He wants the official finding to say that what you did was unauthorized, not because it helps him financially, because it means the record says he was right. She sat with that for a moment. It was both smaller and larger than she'd expected. Smaller because it was personal, human, the kind of grievance that built in the dark over years in the specific way that wounded pride built. Larger because the machinery he'd assembled to pursue it, the law firm, the firm's flag officer advisors, Callum's office, the expedited board motion, the incomplete evidence submission, was real and institutional and had the weight of systems behind it. A man with a wound and enough resources was, in some ways, a more dangerous problem than a man with an objective. "I'll be in Denver in 2 hours," she said. The attorney's name was Catherine Walsh, and she worked out of an office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Denver that had a view of the mountains on clear days and the ceiling of the cloud cover on days like this one, when the weather had moved in from the northwest and turned the sky the color of old concrete. Walsh was 47, compact, with short, gray-streaked hair, and the quality of stillness that Elena recognized from people who had learned to listen at a level most people didn't bother with. She had spent 18 years doing exactly this: military administrative law, review board proceedings, the intersection of classified operational history and institutional process. And she showed the wear of it in the particular way that people showed the wear of difficult work they had chosen deliberately. She had already read Decker's summary. She had the Ferris observation log, Ortega's statement, Petrie's statement, and the certified copy of Doss's duty log entry spread across the conference table in a way that showed she'd been working it for several hours. "Sit down," she said when Elena came in. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Elena sat. Walsh looked at her for a moment. "You drove from Colorado Springs." "Yes." "When did you last eat?" Elena thought about the crackers at the gas station, the coffee at the Elko Motel. "This morning." Walsh picked up her phone, called someone, said, "The usual from the place on Larimer, 2 of them," and put the phone down. "Okay," she said, "let's talk about what we have and what we need and what the next 14 hours look like." She walked through it methodically. The evidentiary picture, as Elena had assembled it, was stronger than Walsh had expected based on the initial summary. The Doss disclosure in particular was structural, not supplemental. An OPUS center authorization log with a duty officer ID number and a countersignature was not a piece of supporting evidence. It was the foundation the petition's procedural argument was built on, and it was built on the assumption that foundation didn't exist. "The question is whether Tate will grant the continuance request," Walsh said. "Decker thinks she won't." "Decker's assessment of Tate is consistent with my experience of her." Walsh tapped a pen against the table. "But Voss's legal team is good. They'll argue that the Doss disclosure was submitted outside the normal evidentiary window and that they need time to respond to new material. That's not an unreasonable argument on its face." "The material was in the same archival system they used," Elena said. "Yes, and Tate will know that. The argument Tate will have to make to herself is whether granting a continuance allows the petitioner to use the delay to shore up their case against the disclosure, or whether the fairness principle requires the time." Walsh paused. "I've seen her go both ways. She's not predictable in the way that some board chairs are predictable." "What do you need from me?" Elena said. "Your account of the engagement, the sequence from first brief through the shot, through the after action. Everything, in the order it happened, with as much operational detail as you can provide without compromising material that's still classified at a level above the board's access." Walsh opened a yellow legal pad. "I need to understand where the gaps are, where Voss's team might push." Elena looked at the legal pad. "The mission brief," she said. "That's their strongest ground. The brief did not explicitly authorize engagement outside the planned target set. It used standard language requiring command authorization for deviation." She paused. "What they're arguing is that Ortega's verbal authorization on the tactical net was insufficient, that deviation required a written order from the mission commander. And your response is the Ops Center Command net transmission. Ortega didn't just authorize on the tactical net, He went up the chain to the ops center and got verbal authorization from the duty officer on the command net. That is command authorization. The duty officer was acting for the Theater Operations Center, which was the relevant command authority for that operational period. She paused. The mission brief's written authorization requirement is written to the standard where deviation happens without command awareness. Ortega specifically sought command awareness. The duty officer provided it. Walsh was writing, fast, precise, the shorthand of someone who had done this a great many times. The phone call Voss made, Walsh said, 4 days after the engagement, to the ops center, asking about archival procedures. Doss's account. If Voss's team knew the duty log existed and structured their evidentiary submission to exclude it, that's not a procedural error. That's deliberate. She stopped writing. Do you know what a referral from Tate to the DOJ looks like in practice? A criminal investigation into evidence tampering in a formal review proceeding. Yes. Walsh set her pen down, which would shift the entire weight of this from a civil liability maneuver to a criminal exposure for Voss's legal team. Possibly Voss himself, if it can be shown he directed the omission. She looked at Elena. That changes his calculus. It changes it if it happens, Elena said. Before it happens, he's still a man with 18 hours and enough resources to make the next 18 hours complicated. Walsh looked at her. You think you'll try something before the hearing? Elena thought about Voss on a flight to Denver, about the 5-year investment, about a man who had built an architecture of institutional pressure and was now watching pieces of it come apart with less than a day to go. I think a man who has been wrong twice and is about to be wrong a third time in the official record will consider his options, she said. And I think his options at this point are either accepting the outcome or doing something that turns the proceeding into a different kind of problem. Define different kind of problem. I don't know exactly, which is the issue. She paused. Is Tate reachable between now and the hearing? Walsh frowned. You can't contact the board chair ex parte. I'm not suggesting contact. I'm asking whether Voss's team can. Walsh's frown deepened. She thought about it. Tate is not... She's not susceptible to informal pressure. She's been in this role for 6 years specifically because she's not. A pause. But the board's administrative support structure is not Tate. And a continuance request filed at 0700 with supporting argument designed to delay rather than address could consume the first 2 hours of the hearing session before Tate rules on it. Burning time, which they could use to... Walsh stopped. She looked at Elena. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that someone who knows the Doss disclosure is in the record and who has been building this case for 5 years has a contingency. I'm thinking the contingency isn't about winning the board proceeding anymore. It's about what comes after the board proceeding. Elena looked at the window. The cloud cover had lowered. The mountains were invisible. A formal petition that gets dismissed with prejudice based on an incomplete evidentiary record creates a discoverable paper trail. If the DOJ looks at that trail, it leads to Voss's firm, to Voss's relationships, to the contract Carver approved. She paused. The contract. What about it? Carver approved a federal contract for Meridian Defense Group, Voss's firm, in 2020. Before his separation. If the DOJ investigation into the evidence tampering reaches the contract approval, they'll look at whether there was a quid pro quo between Carver and Voss. She paused. Carver is dead, but the contract records aren't, and the people at Meridian who benefited from the contract are not dead. Walsh was very still. You're saying Voss's exposure goes beyond the board petition, she said. I'm saying that a DOJ referral from Tate turns this into a financial crimes investigation as well as an evidence tampering investigation. And the people at Meridian who are not Voss, the flag officers on the advisory board, the clients, the investors, those people do not want a DOJ investigation attached to their names. Elena looked at her. Which means Voss, right now, is not just calculating his own exposure. He's calculating what the people behind him will accept. Walsh picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again. If you're right, she said slowly, then the hearing tomorrow isn't the critical moment. The critical moment is whatever Voss decides to do in the next 18 hours, when he understands that his case has collapsed and his firm's exposure is significant. Yes, Elena said, and you can't know what he decides. No, I can only know what I'd decide in his position. She paused. which is to find the one piece of the structure that isn't yet documented and use it before it is. Walsh looked at her. What piece isn't documented? Elena thought about the sequence: the DOS disclosure, Ortega's statement, Ferris's log, Patri's account of the post-operation call, the contract records, the archival inquiry. All of it building toward a record that, when assembled, told a story Voss had spent 5 years trying to prevent from being told. There was one gap. The 2019 complaint, she said, when Voss filed it. The original complaint. It was closed administratively, which means the closing documentation is in the file. But the closing documentation was produced by the officer who reviewed it. She paused. That officer was a brigadier general named Albert Farrow. He reviewed the complaint, found insufficient grounds, and closed it. She paused again. Farrow retired in 2022 and joined an advisory board. She looked at Walsh. Walsh looked back at her. Meridian's advisory board, Walsh said. I don't know, Elena said. I'm asking you to find out, tonight. Walsh looked at the document spread across the table. She looked at Elena. She had the expression of a woman doing a rapid and private assessment of the thing she had just been asked to do and the reason she had been asked to do it, and the implications of both. If Farrow closed the 2019 complaint and subsequently joined the board of the firm that filed the petition, she said carefully, then the closing decision and the petition are both connected to the same institutional interest. Which means the 2019 closure wasn't a neutral administrative finding, Elena said. It was managed. That's a significant allegation. Yes, Elena held her gaze. Which is why I need to know if it's documentable before the hearing. Because if it is, then this isn't just a civil liability maneuver with evidence tampering around the edges. Walsh's voice had gone very quiet. This is a coordinated institutional effort to suppress an operational record for the benefit of a private defense contractor with connections across multiple levels of the review system. Yes, Elena said. The words sat between them in the conference room with the cloud-white Denver sky outside the window and the mountains invisible behind it. Walsh reached for her phone. I'll make some calls, she said. Eat when the food gets here. I'll need you sharp in the morning. Elena nodded. She looked at the documents on the table. The years-old observation log with Ferris's careful handwriting, Doss's duty log entry with its timestamp and countersignature, Ortega's statement that had been submitted through proper channels by a man who had not needed to be asked twice. She thought about Voss on a plane to Denver, about the look on his face in a briefing room in 2019 that she had filed under problem and assumed was resolved. She had been wrong about resolved. She had not been wrong about the shot. The two things were not the same, and the difference between them was the only thing that had ever mattered, and she understood with the clarity of someone reading a map that the next 14 hours would determine whether that difference was allowed to exist in the record or whether it would be buried under a finding that said otherwise. The food arrived. She ate. Walsh found it at 11:41 in the evening. She came out of her private office into the conference room where Elena had been sitting for 3 hours with the documents and a second cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she set a printed page on the table without saying anything first. The page was a screenshot of a publicly available advisory board roster from Meridian Defense Group's corporate website, dated 18 months ago, and cached in a legal research database Walsh's firm subscribed to. Retired Brigadier General Albert Farrow, Senior Defense Policy Advisor. Joined 2022. 4 months after he had signed the closing documentation on the 2019 complaint. Elena looked at the page. She did not touch it. It's public record, Walsh said. The advisory board listing, the retirement date, the complaint closure date, all of it is independently verifiable and none of it requires classified access. She sat down. Elena, this is not circumstantial. This is a documented sequence. Farrow closes the complaint. Farrow joins the firm that subsequently files the petition to reopen the matter the complaint addressed. The closing decision benefited the firm's ability to prosecute the petition years later. The financial relationship between Farrow and the firm postdates the closing decision by 4 months. Conflict of interest, Elena said, at minimum. Depending on what communications existed between Farrow and Voss or Meridian prior to the closing decision, Walsh paused. It could be considerably more than a conflict of interest. Can you get that to Tate before the hearing opens? I can file a supplemental submission to the board docket tonight. It goes into the record regardless of whether Tate reads it before she opens the session. Walsh paused. But I'm going to call Tate's office at 0700 and make sure her clerk knows it's there. Tate will pull the hearing, Elena said. Tate will have no choice but to pull the hearing. You can't proceed with a petition review when the administrative decision that underlies the petition's legitimacy, the original closure, was made by an officer who had a documented financial relationship with the firm prosecuting the petition. Walsh looked at her steadily. The question is what she does after she pulls it. She refers it. She refers it, Walsh confirmed. And at that point, the board petition is the smallest piece of this. They sat with that for a moment. The Denver night outside the 14th floor window was dark and low-clouded. The city lights diffused into an orange glow, the mountains completely invisible. Voss? Elena said. I know. He landed in Denver 4 hours ago. He knows the DOS disclosure is in the record. He's been on the phone with his legal team since the disclosure hit the docket. She looked at the window. When does he find out about Faro? When my supplemental submission hits the docket, which will be... Walsh checked her watch. Within the hour. And then he knows the whole picture. Yes. Elena thought about a man in a hotel room in Denver calculating exposure, not operational exposure. She understood operational exposure and how to manage it. This was institutional exposure, the kind that worked through press releases and congressional inquiries and the specific social violence of having your name appear in a federal referral document. A man who had spent 5 years building something was about to watch it become the instrument of his own destruction, and he would have somewhere between 6 and 8 hours to decide what to do about it. Is there anything he can do? She said. Walsh considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He could contact Faro and attempt to coordinate a story. He could file emergency motions with the board, arguing procedural issues with the supplemental submission. He could instruct his legal team to withdraw the petition before the hearing opens, which would be the rational move. She paused. Or he could do something that isn't rational, because men who have been building a case for 5 years on the basis of a wound to their professional standing are not always operating in a rational mode when that case falls apart overnight. What does irrational look like? I don't know, Walsh said, which is why I'm going to recommend that you don't sleep here tonight. Elena slept at a different hotel, not the one Decker had booked, paid cash, and was awake by 5 in the morning without an alarm. She showered, dressed, and sat by the window watching the city come gray and slow into the pre-dawn until her phone rang at 5:47. It was Decker. The petition has been withdrawn, he said. She had been expecting it since 2 in the morning when the logic of Voss's position had resolved itself into the only move that limited his exposure before Walsh's supplemental submission forced the board to look at everything. She had still been sitting with the relief of it, which was quieter and less satisfying than she had expected. When? She said. 40 minutes ago. Voss's legal team filed a withdrawal with the board's administrative office at 0508. Standard language. Petitioner elects not to proceed at this time. Decker paused. Tate's office received the supplemental submission at midnight. Her clerk flagged it. Tate was briefed at 0430. So Voss knew Tate had the Faro material before he withdrew. He withdrew because Tate had the Faro material. A pause. Elena, Tate didn't wait for the hearing. She referred the matter to the DOJ Inspector General at 0500. 7 minutes before Voss's withdrawal hit the docket. The withdrawal was moot. The referral existed regardless. Faro, she said. Faro's attorney contacted the DOJ IG's office at 0530 to indicate his client was prepared to cooperate with any preliminary inquiry. Decker's voice was very dry. Which is the thing you say when you are a retired general who has realized that cooperation is the only available option that doesn't end in indictment. She sat with the window and the gray Denver morning. Is it over? She said. Decker paused for a long time. The board petition is over. The 2019 matter is closed, really closed this time, with Doss's disclosure and Ferris's log and Ortega's statement in the record, so it can't be reopened by the same mechanism again. He paused. The DOJ inquiry is beginning. That's not over. That will take time, and it will involve interviews and document requests. And, Elena, your name will come up in the inquiry as the subject of the original petition. That's unavoidable. But I'm not the target. You are not the target. A pause. Voss is, potentially Faro, Potentially the law firm's leadership, depending on what they knew about the Pharaoh relationship when they filed. He paused again. Callum's office has gone dark. As of last night, no activity, no filings, no contact with the board. His name isn't on the petition, and there's no document connecting his office to Meridian directly. He's going to let this play out from a distance. He was the one who sent the SUV. Yes. And we can document the surveillance, but surveillance of a former service member in connection with a formal review process is difficult to characterize as misconduct without evidence of intent. Decker paused. The SUV is a loose end, not the most important one. Elena looked at the mountains. They were visible now. The cloud cover had broken somewhere in the night, and the first light was catching the snow line, turning it pink and then pale gold. Ortega, she said. Ferris, Petrie, Doss. All aware of the withdrawal, Ortega called me at 05:15. He said, and I'm quoting exactly, "Good. Now can everyone leave me alone for a while?" Decker's voice held something. Ferris called at 05:20 and asked if you were all right. She closed her eyes briefly. "Tell him yes," she said. Walsh met her for coffee at 7 in the morning at a place near the office that was loud with the ordinary noise of a city starting its day. Walsh looked like she'd slept 3 hours, which was probably accurate. She was on her second coffee when Elena arrived, and she had the alert, slightly raw-edged energy of someone running on competence and caffeine in a proportion she'd long since made peace with. "The DOJ IG referral," Elena said, sitting down. "It'll move slowly," Walsh said. "These things always do, but it'll move." She wrapped her hands around her cup. Tate put everything in the referral. The Pharaoh Advisory Board appointment, the timeline relative to the complaint closure, the evidentiary record of the petition submission, and she paused. She flagged the Ops Center archival inquiry, the call from Voss's extension 4 days after the 2019 engagement. Doss documented that. Doss documented it, and Walsh submitted it, and Tate read it at 4:30 in the morning and put it in the referral. Walsh looked at her. "The woman is thorough." Elena drank her coffee. It was better than the gas station coffee. Not substantially, but enough. "What happens to Voss?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "If the IG investigation finds what the documents suggest it will find," Walsh set her cup down. "Voss spent 5 years and significant resources prosecuting a petition he knew was built on an incomplete evidentiary record. He maintained relationships with at least one official who had influence over the original complaint closure while simultaneously building the legal mechanism to relitigate that closure. He may have directed his legal team to omit material evidence from the petition submission." She paused. "The range of outcomes for a man in that position is not good." "He believed he was right," Elena said. Walsh looked at her. "Does that matter?" Elena thought about it honestly. "It matters to him," she said. "It doesn't change what he did." Walsh nodded. She didn't add anything to that, which was the right call. They sat for a moment in the coffee shop noise, orders being called, the grind of the espresso machine, someone's phone playing a fragment of music, the ordinary friction of people moving through their morning. "What do you do now?" Walsh said. Elena looked at her coffee cup. It was a fair question, and she hadn't fully prepared an answer, which was unusual for her and which she recognized as significant in the way that unusual things were significant, as information about the state she was in. "I don't know," she said. Walsh studied her. "When did you leave service?" 2021. "And since then?" "Consulting, some training work, nothing formal." She paused. "I've been careful about formal." "Because of 2019. "Because of 2019, she confirmed. "And because the kind of work I know how to do requires institutional trust in both directions, and I wasn't sure the institution trusted me." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Hale's training modification order, before it got pulled." "Yes." "You know he filed it again," Walsh said. Elena looked at her. "Yesterday afternoon, different paperwork, different routing, not through the range administrative system. Filed directly through the training and doctrine command, with his personal authorization attached." Walsh's voice was matter-of-fact. "It's in the official record now. Harder to pull without generating the kind of documentation that asks uncomfortable questions about who's pulling it and why." Elena said nothing. "He also submitted a formal recommendation to the TRADOC program office," Walsh continued, recommending the establishment of an advanced long-range qualification standard. Named. She paused. With your service record through 2019 attached as the basis for the qualification criteria. He didn't ask me, Elena said. No. Walsh almost smiled. He didn't. Elena looked out the window. The Denver street was fully awake now. People walking, a delivery truck double parked, the ordinary complicated motion of a city that didn't know or care about board hearings and radio logs, and the specific weight of a 5-year-old night in a place without electricity. It's a lot, she said, not complaining, just accurately describing the mass of the thing. Yes, Walsh said. It is. She called Hale from the parking garage because it was quiet, and she needed quiet for this particular call. His aide answered, verified, transferred. Hale picked up on the second ring. Brooks, he said. You filed the modification order again, she said. I did. Without telling me. You were busy. A pause. It's the right call. Has been since the first time I filed it. The administrative interference doesn't change the underlying reasoning. She leaned against the concrete pillar. Somewhere below, a car engine echoed up from a lower level. The qualification standard, she said. My record is the basis. Yes. That puts my name in an official program document, permanently. Yes, he said again. It does. She was quiet for a moment. It was the thing she'd spent 3 years avoiding. Not recognition, exactly, but the specific kind of institutional attachment that made you findable in a particular way, that gave people a fixed point to aim at. She had spent a lot of time being unfixed. It also, Hale said, puts the 2019 service record in an official program document, with the engagement notation, in a context that is about qualification criteria, not about a review petition. He paused. It becomes part of how we teach, which means it becomes harder to characterize as a liability and considerably easier to characterize as an asset. She understood what he was doing. The record she'd spent 5 years watching be used as a weapon was being, in the most practical and unsentimental way available, converted into something else. Not erased, not reframed, simply placed in a different structure that changed what it meant institutionally. You could have told me, she said. Would you have agreed to it? She thought about that honestly. I don't know, she said. I know, he said. Which is why I filed it and called it done. She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but it was close. The DOJ referral, she said. Tate's referral. You knew about Farrow. A pause. I knew about Farrow in 2022, he said, when his advisory board appointment was made public. I noted the timeline. I didn't have enough to do anything with it at that point. A retired general joining a defense advisory firm is not by itself remarkable. Another pause. When the petition was filed and I saw Meridian's name attached to it, I had enough. You were the one who put my civilian observer registration into the system, she said. The DOD addendum. The silence on the line lasted long enough to be a confirmation. I needed you visible, he said. In a setting where your capability was on record and your identity was attached to that record in a way that was clean and documented and difficult to subsequently obscure. He paused. If the petition succeeded and there was a formal unauthorized engagement finding, the finding needed to exist alongside a current, verified record of your professional conduct. The range demonstration was that record. She stood in the concrete quiet of the parking garage. You used me, she said. Not with anger. With the precise descriptive accuracy of someone naming a thing correctly. I used a situation that was going to happen to you regardless, he said. The petition was filed before I made the registration call. Callum's surveillance was in place before Redstone. You were already in their sights. A pause. I gave you a platform. What you did on it was entirely your own. She thought about the Barrett on lane 7, the wind flags, the 5 rounds, and the silence after. The group of Marines who had stood in the desert heat and recalibrated something. She thought about Reyes, watching her walk toward the gate. I want to see the qualification standard document, she said, before it's finalized. I'll have my aide send it today. And Hale. Yes. Next time you decide to engineer a situation that involves my professional record and my physical location. She paused. Tell me first. A long pause on his end. That's fair, he said. And then, after a moment, I'll try. It was the honest version of a promise, which was better than the clean version. She ended the call. She drove back to Nevada the long way. Not because the long way was faster, it wasn't, but because she needed the hours and the desert and the particular quality of attention that driving alone through big country produced in her. The kind of thinking that wasn't planning and wasn't worrying, but was something in between, the mind running at idle and occasionally producing something useful. She thought about Voss. Not with satisfaction. She'd examined herself for satisfaction and found something murkier and more honest, something closer to a tired acknowledgement that a thing had resolved in the direction of the truth. Voss had built his architecture on a wound and had sustained it for 5 years, on the belief that the record could be made to say what he needed it to say. He had been wrong. Not about the wound was real, the humiliation of being the intelligence officer whose assessment didn't predict the scenario the operator had to solve for, but about the record. The record was stubborn in a way that personal grievance wasn't. She thought about Ferris and his observation log, kept in a steel cabinet in a machine shop for 9 years, precise and untouched. She thought about Ortega's voice on the phone. No hesitation, I'll do it. And about Petrie finding a JAG officer independently because Ortega had called, and that had been enough. She thought about Doss eating his sandwich over a topographic printout, keeping a contact number for a woman named Petria Sandoval, because he had felt, for 5 years, that the thing was not fully finished. These were not people who had loved her or owed her. They were people who had been in a place on a night when the geometry was very tight and the clock was running, and they had carried the accurate version of that night in their bodies, the way you carried things that mattered, and when the moment came to put it on record, they had done it without being asked twice. She thought about that for a long time. The Nevada desert came up in the late afternoon. The flat, pale expanse of it, the heat shimmer, the mountains in the distance that looked close enough to reach in an hour and were 3 hours away. She rolled the window down. The air smelled like sage and dry earth and the faint mineral edge of the alkali flats. She stopped for gas at the same station where she'd eaten the cardboard crackers 3 days ago. The grain elevator, the memory of a population. She filled the tank and bought a better version of the crackers. Not good, but better. And stood beside her car eating them in the cooling afternoon light. The black SUV was not here. There was nothing on the highway in either direction except distance. She finished the crackers. She got back in the car. Reyes called her that evening. She didn't know how he'd gotten her number, and then she remembered that Kopech had her contact information from the range registration, and Kopech was the kind of person who answered questions from Marines he worked with. I heard about the board thing, he said. The withdrawal. Word travels, she said. Kopech has a brother-in-law in the JAG office. A pause. Are you okay? She was on the highway, the sun going down behind the mountains, the sky ahead of her turning colors she didn't have words for. She thought about the question. The second time in a week someone had asked it, which was more than the previous year combined. Getting there, she said. The qualification standard, he said. I heard that's moving forward, the TRADOC filing. It appears to be. Sergeant Whitmore wants me to tell you something, Reyes said. He paused, and she could hear him working out how to deliver whatever Whitmore had said. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell her I'll teach the damn standard correctly if they let me, and I'll be the first person to fail any instructor who doesn't." Another pause. I think that's an apology and an offer. She was quiet for a moment. Tell him I heard him, she said. After she ended the call, the highway was very quiet. The last light was leaving the sky. The stars were coming up in the east, sharp and early, the way they came up in the desert where there was nothing between you and them. She thought about Lane 7, the Barrett on the bipod. The wind flags she'd been reading all afternoon before anyone knew she was reading them. The 5 rounds and the steel ringing in the distance and the particular silence that follows something that cannot be underdone. She had not fired this Barrett that day to prove anything. She had fired it because Hale had said let her shoot, and she had said yes, and the rifle had been there, and the target had been at 1,980 meters in a crosswind that required reading. And reading crosswinds in the desert was simply a thing she knew how to do. That was all it had ever been. The problem, she understood now, was not that people had underestimated her. People underestimated things they didn't understand, and that was an unremarkable feature of the world. The problem was that the machinery of institutional record-keeping could be used to make the underestimation permanent. To take a specific night in a specific place and strip it of its context until only the vulnerability remained, until the thing you had done correctly looked like the thing someone else needed it to be. The machinery had failed. Not dramatically, not in a single decisive moment. It had failed the way things failed when the record was more stubborn than the people trying to shape it. Incrementally, one document at a time, one person's careful handwriting in an observation log preserved in a steel cabinet in Colorado Springs. The road ahead was straight and long, and the stars were fully out now, the Milky Way visible as a smear of cold light across the black. She drove. 6 months later, the first cohort of candidates attempted the Brooks Standard qualification at Redstone. 41 candidates, 17 completed it. The qualification required exceptional long-range accuracy under variable conditions, calm decision-making under simulated operational pressure, and this was the criterion that eliminated the most candidates. The ability to accurately assess environmental conditions using field observation rather than electronic instrumentation. The wind flags, not the gauge. Reyes passed on his first attempt. He was 24 and had driven from his duty station in California on his own leave to do it. Whitmore ran the qualification block for the advanced section and failed 3 instructors who didn't know the difference between fighting a rifle's recoil and riding it. Harlan Voss's consulting contract with Meridian Defense Group was terminated 8 weeks before the qualification cohort ran. The DOJ IG investigation had produced a preliminary finding that the petition submission had contained material omissions, and 3 partners at the law firm that had filed the petition had entered into discussions with federal prosecutors that made continued association with Voss professionally inadvisable. Voss's name appeared in the preliminary finding, in the section dealing with the origin and direction of the evidentiary omissions. The investigation was ongoing. Farrow, cooperating, had confirmed the sequence of the advisory board appointment and the complaint closure, and had provided communications records that the IG's office found interesting in ways that extended beyond Farrow himself. Elena was not at Redstone for the first qualification cohort. She was at a facility in a different state, doing work she was not at liberty to describe, which was the way she had always preferred it. Decker had called her 3 weeks after Denver with an offer that was framed as a consulting arrangement and was functionally something more than that, and she had taken it after considering it for less time than she had expected to need. She had conditions. She'd laid them out in a conversation with Decker that was shorter and more direct than most conversations about conditions for classified work tended to be. "I want the 2019 record," she said. "The complete record, including the Ops Center log and Ferris's observation notes, permanently attached to my file in the active section, not the historical section, active." "That's not standard," Decker said. "No," she said. "It isn't." A pause. "I'll make it happen." "And Nathan?" She paused. "The 17 people, the ones in the basement, the after-action had a displacement notation. They were moved to a secondary location." She paused. "I want to know what happened to them." A longer pause. "That's going to take some looking," he said. "I know." He found out 6 weeks later. The answer was that 12 of the 17 were documented in refugee resettlement records as having successfully relocated to a third country through an international humanitarian network. 3 were unaccounted for in open records. 2 had died, not violently, in the years since. 1 from illness, 1 from a cause the records described as undetermined. 12 out of 17. It was not a perfect number. It was the kind of number that existed in the real world, where things were not perfectly resolved and the cost of necessary action was paid in the specific currency of the irreducibly uncertain. She sat with the number for a long time. Then she went back to work. The Barrett that had been fired on Lane 7 at Redstone was eventually mounted in a case in the range's main building, beside a placard that listed the qualification standard and its criteria. Below the criteria, the placard carried a single line: "Skill is patient. It waits for the moment when it's needed, and then it does the work." Not Elena's words. Hale had written it. She had read it when Kopech sent her a photograph of the installation and had thought about calling Hale to argue about the phrasing, and then had decided against it because the phrasing was not wrong, only slightly more composed than she would have been. She put the photograph in a drawer. She had work to do. To everyone watching this story, The people who are never introduced, never applauded, and never asked to be seen are often the ones carrying the most. The quiet ones. The ones who do the work correctly and then disappear. You may have passed one today and not known it. Pay attention to who shows up when the moment is hard, and remember that strength has never required an audience.